Hi friends, and welcome back to Abridged by Alpal. I think that's the channel name that I've decided on. I've gone through many iterations. I really like that it's a little bit vague so I can talk about more than just books, as well as it matches the name of my store on Redbubble, so I kind of have that consistency, which I really enjoy. Today I wanted to walk you through some of my favorite books and series as a way to introduce you to my tastes. Taste is maybe a strong word for that because most of them are very basic and have been vetted by millions of people before, as well as sharing some personal stories of why I enjoy these books so much. We are going to start off incredibly strong with probably my favorite series of all time. This was so easy for me to throw on my list as soon as I started making it. And this series is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. For me, this series is very nostalgic, which feels a little bit messed up to say about a series about children dying, but hear me out. I first read this series because the movie was coming out and I had a rule for myself that I would not go and see a movie based off of a book without reading the book first. I had a friend who asked me if I wanted to go see it with her about a week before it came out, and I said, sorry, I don't really want to do that. I would like to read the book first. And then 5 days later went to her and said, hey, I could go see that with you now. Do you still want to go see it? And she said, did you finish the first book? And I said, no, I finished the whole series. That's just the kind of person that I am. Adding to that nostalgia, a few summers later, I reread the series 8 times in one summer. I always judge people a little bit when they're like, I finished this series and then I go back and I pick up the first book. I'm like, who does that? That's crazy. I did that. This is probably the only series I've done that for. I also really enjoyed that the movies for a while were coming out in November. And so a few years in a row, I got to take my friend to go see the movie as her birthday present. With Sunrise on the Reaping coming out in November of 2026, I believe, I have entertained the idea of flying out to her since we live in different states now and taking her to go see the movie for old time's sake. The next series on my list is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. Now, I mentioned this a little bit in my first video. I read this series when I was very lonely. I was on a study abroad in London, and the people that I was hanging out with for the first month of that study abroad were no longer reaching out, and I had no idea why. So I spent the next month of the study abroad without anybody to really default to when I wanted to do things. And since I was scared of going out alone, not because I was scared of London, it's a very safe city, but because I felt like I was going to be judged, I spent a lot of time reading. So this series, as well as another book that will come later on this list, were books that I once again just tore through. I really like the way that this series made me consider what makes a person and at what point in their journey of change do they become someone else entirely. Pierce Brown also uses other mythologies in the series very well as a way to describe cultures without having to say too much. Obsidians are based heavily off of Norse mythology, and I think I'm correct on this, Reds are based off of Celtic mythology. The action sequences in the series are insane. I don't know how someone writes space battles so well, given there's no way that you have experience for that. It also has a lot of really good politics where a lot is at stake, but at the same time, nothing tangible is at stake. And so you're kind of like, what do I do? It's my reputation. It's what gives me power, but I'm not physically in danger. Now for a little bit of rhyming. We've got Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. I had a really interesting journey with this series because I started it when only the first 2 or 3 were out, forgot about it for years, and it wasn't until the last book had been out for a couple more years that my mom said, hey, there's a bundle for these ebooks, should I get them? And I said, oh my gosh, yes, I need to finish that series. And then I had to spark notes the first few books that I had already read to remember where I was. I didn't want to go back and reread all of them. Over the course of the next year, finish the series. Kingdom of Ash is probably one of the most satisfying endings in a series I've ever read. There's a scene in that book that damaged me emotionally so much. It was probably the first time I cried reading a book. And again, in this series, there's a lot of politicking, a lot of maneuvering to get what you want, but also has action sequences that I don't black out for. Often I find myself just kind of zoning out and then coming back in at the end of a fight and being like, oh, that person won. But in doing that, missing a lot of things and actions that do have consequences later, and I just don't remember them. It has a very complicated, in-depth world, a world that gives you the sense that there's way more to be discovered, but we will probably never know about it. Now, I don't have many standalones on this list, but this is one of them that I will stand by for the rest of my life. And that is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. I do not understand why Cosmere fans ignore it so much. I feel like the common attitude towards this book is, yeah, I read it, it was good, and then I moved on with Stormlight and Mistborn, which are phenomenal series, don't get me wrong. I just feel like this is the book that really set up a lot of quintessential Cosmere attributes that Brandon has delivered on time and time again in the books that he's published since. Also, these are some of my favorite Cosmere characters. Both Serene and Raoden are very inspiring in the way that they're willing to rise to a challenge, and Serene's just, top character for me. If I had to make a list of 5, she'd be on it for sure. It was 20 years of Elantris, and there was no one else dressed up from Elantris. There were a few people, but just like proportionally just pitiful. This one is such a duh series and maybe a low-hanging fruit, but I have my reasons for it. And that is Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling. This was probably the series that cemented my love of reading at a young age. I also remember being on a road trip with my family and they were listening to the audiobook for Deathly Hallows. Now at this time I had not actually read the series myself yet, so I was not invested in the storyline or the characters or any of it. And so while I'm falling in and out of consciousness, because that's how you deal with the road trip, you just sleep the entire time, they listen to this scene where, spoiler alert, Dobby dies. And everyone's upset about it, and I just don't care. And I'm just like, whatever. And then, come back to it a while later and was also devastated by that. I also remember going to see the movies with my family, specifically Half-Blood Prince, because we went to go see it with my cousin, and he bought a huge tub of popcorn. And then there's a jump scare, which if you know, you know, and he threw the popcorn all over the place. Literally his row in front of him, row behind him, it was all over. I think one of the reasons why this series is so beloved is because it grew up with a lot of the readers. The first few books are very whimsical and definitely describe a world that many people want to be a part of, but then it gets darker and grittier as the series goes along and very angsty. Shout out to book 5, and that really resonated with a lot of the readers. This next series is on the list because it is my guilty pleasure reread series. Anytime I need something unserious and safe, comfortable, I will go back to this one, and this series is The Selection by Kiera. I won't apologize for being just a girl who wants to be a princess, but I also feel like this series really encapsulates girlhood and the way that women stick by each other even if they haven't necessarily gotten along. Truly there are friendships in this series where they hate each other at the beginning, and by the end of the series they're willing to die for each other. This is another duh series. It's father fantasy, Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I had The Hobbit read aloud to me as a kid and tried to pick up The Lord of the Rings after on my own, but it was too much for a child. So I didn't actually pick it up again until I went to college. There was a Tolkien class for one of my general credits. Super unfortunately, this was the semester that COVID hit, but for me it was a blessing in disguise because I got to listen to the audiobooks as I drove back home. I was going to school out of state, and then every time I finished a book, I got to watch the movie with my parents. Apparently, Lord of the Rings was one of their favorite series growing up, but none of my siblings or I had actually read the books. Most of us had seen the movies, but I was the first one of us to actually read them. Also, my hot take on the Lord of the Rings is that I do low-key love the Ent section. I understand why people find it really boring, but it's so unserious, and there's a lot of dark stuff and a lot of hard stuff that happens in the rest of the series, and this was just not one of them. It's just fun. We're gonna take a little bev break. I got an advent calendar from Fortnum & Mason that is a new tea every day. Love it. It's bringing me so much joy. Okay, this is it. This is the one I think that it is going to catch people a little bit off guard. Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. Now, his last name is French. I won't apologize if I'm saying it wrong. What I will apologize for is the fact that I've read it when I was a teenager, and so I was a little bit into the Phantom, and when I say a little, I do mean. And that was definitely a red flag. This book is beautifully tragic and tragically beautiful. There is a scene, it's a chapter heading, and I remember this because I remember it being on a fresh page, where the author is describing the way that dust particles dance through the air and catch the light in these old curtains in an old theater, and it is so beautiful. There's also a much deeper understanding of the characters in the book as compared to the musical, which is obvious. Way more content, way more opportunity to explain their motivations. I think that if you are a fan of the musical, you should go and read this book for sure. And speaking of the musical, I actually turned down seeing it when I was a kid because I thought it was going to be too boring. I have regretted that for the rest of my life. I did see it twice though when I was in London, once for my birthday and once so I could get a better seat and be closer to the front. If you are a fan of sci-fi and you have not read Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, what are you doing with your life? This book is perfection. It really is. I read it for the first time as part of a book club with my sister and our best friend. We were living in different states at the time, so we all picked a book, bought a paperback copy of it, and then would take notes and make little doodles in the margin and then send the book off to the next person. And so by the end of it, we each had a book that was annotated by our favorite people. That copy of Project Hail Mary is truly a national treasure. My mom read it a couple years later and she said it was so fun to feel like she was reading the book with someone. One of the best features of Project Hail Mary is the way that Andy Weir is able to explain scientific concepts without the reader, at least me, feeling like they are being condescended to. Now, for people who have specialized in some of those areas, probably feel a little bit different, but as someone who is a fan of STEM topics but not necessarily someone who has done a deep dive into them, did an excellent job of explaining them to me without making me feel dumb. There is a great slow reveal in this book. I don't think this is a spoiler because you learn about it pretty much on page 1, I think, but the main character has amnesia and is slowly remembering things as the book goes on, and so when he finally realizes why he is where he is, that's also the first time the reader is figuring it out, so you get to kind of share that experience. There's also a lot of oh crap, you're right moments in this book. I won't say which one specifically like stands out the most to me because I do think that would be too much of a spoiler, but there's a lot of those like, this is probably so obvious in hindsight, but I would have literally never thought of it on my own. It's also a surprisingly heartwarming book. I think that a lot of sci-fi that takes place in space always has this sense that something malicious is going on in the back. The reader's kind of set up for that, but then it ends up being really wholesome. The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, later finished by Brandon Sanderson, is a fantasy classic. I didn't read it until earlier this year. I thought that it was going to be way too long and I never wanted to do it, but after finishing Wind and Truth last year and being done with the Cosmere for the first time, I really needed something to fill in that void, and I thought that since Sanderson finished the series, it might be a good thing to do that, and it totally was. It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion because these characters slowly go crazy and you realize that they might not necessarily be doing the right good things anymore, but you can't look away from it because you have to know how it ends. There's also enough content in that series to have fed the gremlin for months. I started it either at the very end of 2024 or the beginning of 2025 and wasn't finished with the series until June. It was the first time in a long time that I was only reading one book. Usually I have a few that I'm reading concurrently so that depending on my mood when I want to read, I can pick up something that matches that. But with the Wheel of Time, I had to have it all. And only Wheel of Time. I also have to shout out Sanderson for this. I know it's been said before, I know it'll be said again, but he does such a good job finishing the series. There were moments reading the last 3 where I was like, oh my gosh, like I forgot that this is someone else entirely different. I know his prose and his writing style isn't exactly like one for one with Robert Jordan, but he carries the plot on and the characters on so seamlessly that I feel like you don't notice. So if The Hunger Games is my long-standing favorite, I think that A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin is like the new upstart in my favorite. I read it for the first time 2 years ago, and again, it's the political tension that draws me into this so deeply, as well as the characters in the series being some of the realest characters I've ever read. Sansa and Catelyn get a lot of hate, but I think that's because a lot of people haven't been a teenage girl before, and they haven't been a mother before, and how unique of an experience that is, and how well Martin is able to tie that into their motivations. Specifically Sansa, I remember reading through her scenes and being like, oh my gosh, yes, I feel so seen. As someone who was maybe a slightly problematic teenage girl at one point in my life, I like to think that I've moved on past that. This is how I would have acted. Like, these are the decisions I would have made at that time. So I love Sansa. I think that she is overhated. I love the way that this series makes you feel, and even though they might not necessarily be positive feelings all the time, you're feeling something. There's not a lot of series that have made me feel something as viscerally as A Song of Ice and Fire, except for the next one on this list. There's a lot of anger and betrayal and frustration, as well as a lot of hope and victory in this series, and you feel it all in a very good way. The fact that there's no ending to this series as of yet, to me, is fine, because the world building and the character development is so realistic that in the way that life doesn't have a neat ending, this series doesn't have a neat ending. That being said, there's a lot of promises that have yet to be fulfilled, so if Martin is able to go back to the series and finish it, that would also be good. People say, well, because I want this thing has to be bad, and I don't think that's true. Speaking of feeling big feelings, Manacled / Alchemized by Sen Lin Yu made me feel so much, and not necessarily in a good way, but I was feeling something, and that was great. This is the other book that I read at that time where I was kind of lonely, so I think I consumed it too fast the first time. It left me very shaken, and I read it as Manacled. When Alchemized was published this year, I did pick it up again. The world was darker without the storyline itself being darker. I like the lesson that it teaches, that sometimes you gotta compromise, like someone has to be willing to get their hands dirty in order to achieve the outcome that you want, and how sometimes, and I'm not gonna say all the time, people will feel like making a compromise would taint the outcome in some sort of way, but really, if you want the best for people, and if we're talking utilitarianism here, sacrifices have to be made. It's also a very complex world. The group that the main character is in, and the country that the main character is in, as well as the countries surrounding that country, all feel very well developed, and like there's so many moving parts. But the storyline itself is actually quite simple. Like, there is a very clear objective, one thing that needs to be happening at any given point, and I really like that. I think that is unique amongst books. Also, if we're going back to like the slightly toxic part of me, the I would burn the world for you trope, it's hot, okay? It's hot. But the opposite side of I would sacrifice you to save the world is also good. Once again, we can have both. The next series on my list is Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. I read the entire series, and no one's gonna be shocked by this at this point. Read the entire series in 3 days. It's kind of a haze to me, but I feel so strongly for the characters in this book, and I love the way that they are trying to beat the unbeatable, and they don't give up just because people are telling them it's unbeatable. And I choose this one over Six of Crows, despite being a little bit more attached to the characters in Six of Crows, because that duology is a little bit too nitty-gritty for me. I like that Shadow and Bone has a little bit more hope in it, and it's a bit lighter. A lot of people don't like Mal, and I disagree with them. Last on my list, but certainly not least, is Dune by Frank Herbert. Again, I think it's the politics that draw me into this book so much. I just, give me some of that tension. I love it so much. It teaches the lessons of heroes aren't necessarily always heroes, and the dangers of a demagogue very well, especially when it moves into Dune Messiah, the second book. I think that is an excellent example of what can happen if things aren't handled delicately. It also explores the concept of what is truly justified when you have been wronged so deeply. In which ways are you allowed to retaliate without going too far yourself? Also, to end on a happy note, the movie adaptation that has come out in the recent years is my favorite adaptation of all time. The cinematography is truly so beautiful and so artistic. The director handled it phenomenally and was able to maintain the tone of the books very, very well. And the actors did such a good job of encapsulating what makes each one of the characters their own person. All right, so those are my top books in series. It ended up being 14. I was trying really hard to get it to a top 10, but I couldn't cut any of these books or series even if I tried. Just really quick, I wanted to do some honorable mentions. Number 1, The Bound and the Broken by Ryan Cahill. The reason why this is an honorable mention is because I'm currently reading it, and I do feel like I need to sit with a book or a series for a while before I realize the impact that it's had on me. But if you're a fan of The Wheel of Time and or Aragon, I do highly recommend it. Another honorable mention that I'm going to throw out there is Circe by Madeline Miller. A lot of people have a lot of love for Song of Achilles, but personally I find Circe a better story. Couldn't tell you why. I hope that this gave you a better understanding of what I enjoy in a book, and if you found yourself agreeing with me on any of these topics, I hope that you come back for more. If there are any other ideas, anything that you would love to see in the book space that you aren't currently seeing, let me know. We'd love to see you guys soon. Bye! Welcome to ASMR with Al Pal. Ooh, today is brought to you by, can't remember this color. Oh, Spirit Water from the Mooncat and Avatar The Last Airbender collaboration. You can't really see it right now. Oh my gosh, I got a bubble in this one so bad. They change color. It's a thermal. So when they're cold, they'll go to like a darker gray. And when they're warm, they're this nice teal that you're seeing right now. So yeah, love nail polish. Mooncat sponsor me. Fortnum & Mason sponsor me. Starbucks sponsor me. Oh my gosh, I love going to Starbucks and getting a bev and working or reading or whatever. But yeah, nail polish.